Howdy. Thank you, Tom. So as Tom mentioned, I am going to be your host for today. I've been asked very kindly to not make any REST jokes, and I'm going to try to actually follow through on that. It is going to be kind of hard, but if I can give it a rest, I will. Whoops. So I am going to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is the CTO and co-founder of HumanMade, a WordPress core committer and a contributing developer to the REST API. He's used the REST API to build native applications, to build websites. He even built a website deployment system powered by the REST API. He's the regular co-host of the Draft podcast on Post Status. He's been described as a true corker that knows one's onions. And I'd like you to please join me in welcoming Joe Hoyle to the stage.
Is this thing on? Can you hear me? All right. I have to switch laptops here. Apologies. Okay. Aha, there we go. Okay. So as Aaron's fantastic introduction mentioned, I'm Joe Hoyle. I'm Joe_Hoyle on Twitter. And today I'm going to be talking about diving into the REST API. So my kind of aim for this session is really to orient everybody on what are the REST API's capabilities, how you can use it, how you can build on it, and hopefully for the kind of rest of the sessions we have today, you'll be able to place those a lot better in your mind as to exactly where they're related to the greater ecosystem of the whole API, front end, back end, things like that. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about is consuming the REST API. So this is primarily for building applications and things like that on top of the API. Just see if I can present it. So this could be building things like decoupled apps on it using different server-side technology, Node, things like that. Also native apps with Objective-C or with React Native or something like that. So starting at kind of the basics of what is a REST API. I think we kind of probably all know that, but either way, there's a quick kind of demo here. So the REST API allows you to send requests to routes, specify arguments to them, and adjust the response. And that's kind of what's going on here. This can kind of be scaled up to a little more complex example. So here, I have a quick recording of me making a request to the REST API on the command line to get some posts. Also adding a search query to search for the word world. I can also pipe that into other things to get just the title for those posts, or just the links, and now I have the links. I can send a delete request to all of those posts and delete them all automatically, or via the REST API in kind of one quick command line code. So that's kind of a snapshot of how easily we can programmatically control WordPress now versus before we were much more limited to managing by the API or building plugins in PHP to be able to control specific use cases and flows that we wanted to build. All of that possibility is now opened up to different platforms, programming languages, and things like that. So it's, I think, to me, the kind of core principle is it's so much more powerful now to use WordPress because you can control it in so many different ways than you used to be able to. And that just allows you to build further abstractions on top of it. So the primitives that you kind of have in the REST API is broadly falls into these 5 things, which is posts, pages, the media, terms, and users. Like this is the core data types of WordPress. And all of those things you can get via the REST API at the routes that are shown here. So all quite standard stuff as you would expect. And we don't have every single thing that is in WordPress or that ever could be in WordPress displayed here. But there's also a huge amount of extensibility that you can do with the REST API. For example, WooCommerce has its API built by the same infrastructure. So there are routes available if you have the WooCommerce plugin enabled. The same for things like Restrict Content Pro. Lots of other plugins we're seeing now adopting building endpoints via the REST API to open up their plugins and services to developers to be able to build things on top of as well. I think WooCommerce is a good example of that, where you can build a lot of different experiences to do with building different stores, like native apps as being a store for your website, or custom apps for WooCommerce on the admin side as well, ways to insert products and ways to do data analytics on your sales and things like that. So I'll kind of go over that a little bit later, how you do that from the backend side, but it's good to know as a consumer that plugins are starting to implement APIs, so as a developer wanting to build things, that is there, and you can also kind of request that from plugin authors as well. So in terms of the things that you're actually likely to see in the API as somebody consuming it, building something on it, there's a few things that I want to go over that are kind of interesting about the REST API that's going to get you a little bit further than just knowing, okay, there's some routes here where I can get data from. There's a little more to it than that. One of those things is the way that we handle linking, or almost follow a standard called out. And this is a way in the API, as a consumer, for you to be able to get related objects. So if I get a post, and let's say there's an object for the category, these two have a relationship, and that relationship is specified in the REST API. So for example, if I were to get a post from the REST API, see the route at the top, and that is the response. All responses in the REST API have a kind of magic underscore links item in it as well, which tells you relations to other objects within the REST API. So this can be things like comments, the featured images, for example, the parent of the current post, if there is one, and any kind of relationship you can think of, like that is in WordPress's data set. So the idea is then you would be able to make GET requests for those links, which are to other objects in the REST API. And again, if you're viewing this in the browser, you can kind of just click between the different relations and kind of explore your whole object graph, if you like, of all of your WordPress data. Another really handy thing that you can do on top of this is embedding the related objects directly in the response of the REST API. So as you can see in underscore links, we have the discussion key, which links to the comments. If we add underscore embed to the end of any request as a param, we'll automatically get an underscore embedded property of the response, and we'll get all of the embedded objects in there as well. It's very common, again, when you're building real-world things on the REST API, you probably don't just want to get a post to display it. You're also going to need the author object to display the name of the user underneath, or the featured image object to be able to actually display the featured image next to the title, or something like that. So the kind of approach that the REST API takes is quite an atomic one at the data level. Have different objects for quite a lot of things, and then link them together, versus just kind of putting everything into the post object at a fundamental level. It's kind of a lot more destructured than that. So that is linking. The next thing is kind of unique, I'd say, or more unusual about the REST API is a thing called the schema, which is a kind of meta level that rests on the top or underneath, really, the whole of the REST API. So what the heck does this mean exactly? So usually, again, when I make a GET request for any resource in the API, I do the usual GET and the URL of the object, and the response is the result of the object. In the REST API, for any URL like this, you can also send an options request. For any who don't know, you have get, post, delete. Options is just another verb in HTTP. The response for this gives us kind of a meta description of the data that lives at that URL. So here you can see we get this JSON blob of like the ID, and it tells you what type of data that is, and it has a human readable description to tell you what it does. You can see there's kind of a one-to-one relationship. For everything that is in an actual object, there should be an entry within the schema for that entry to tell you some information about it. We also show things like enum, so only possible values for updating the status. This allows you to do things like building UIs, maybe with drop-downs that can have an automatic, other options that you can set that field to. You can also do automatic validation on the client side before you need to post to the server. So you can check if something actually is a number when it should be, or if its value is within a given enum. We also use this to build the documentation for the REST API. And again, if you're building custom routes and custom endpoints on the back end, again, if you're using this schema, then you're going to be able to generate documentation from it, from existing tooling quite easily. So this is a kind of odd part of the API. It's an often undiscovered part, but really the whole API is built on the concept of what the schema provides. So actually internally in a lot of the API, we're writing the schema for an endpoint before the implementation, and that is a kind of blueprint to say this is how the API is going to work before necessarily needing to do the nuts and bolts. Needless to say, this was a somewhat controversial decision because it's kind of an extra level of abstraction and complexity that doesn't necessarily need to be there. And if I would have to sum up the kind of WordPress project philosophy, it is kind of not to adopt extra abstractions and things like that. It's typically a little more just closer to the metal in terms of it just kind of provides you the functionality it does and it doesn't over-engineer things. So there needed to be real-world use cases for actually having something like this. So when we have an internal schema, we do things like automatically validating and sanitizing data when it's input, again, providing the documentation for it, much more easily doing error handling. All of that is a carrot to be able to use a kind of more abstracted system like this. Otherwise, it's extra complexity for no gain. So authentication, again, as a consumer of the REST API, is something that's going to be quite important to you. Unless you're building something quite basic, which is a reading experience on the REST API, a read-only experience, then you're going to need some level of authentication. You may even need authentication to do reading experiences for things like allowing people to read pending or draft posts, so you need a way for them to log in to get permission to do something like that. With the REST API, because you're operating programmatically with everything, there's no way to just display a login form or something, like there is if you're doing PHP. You get to mix both your logic for your application with UI. Like PHP does both of those things, so you typically are able to do both of those things together. In the REST API, that isn't the case. You're just sending JSON back and forth over an HTTP connection. There's no mechanism to just make somebody log in as part of that, so we have to have authentication schemes as part of a REST API. I'm sure most people that have used APIs in the past are like fully aware of this fact, but it's good to kind of look at it from a first principle of why it's required that. So for that reason, we have different authentication methods that we support, and there are others available for things like JWT, and I think there may be an OAuth 2 one in the works, but these are the ones I'm going to talk about today. But all of these are pluggable, so building new authentication mechanisms isn't actually all that difficult. And this is just kind of, I think with these four, we're covering most use cases, but certainly alternatives exist for all of these protocols, really. And I just hope kind of the ecosystem of those grows over time. So yesterday at the workshops, I did 4 hours on authentication and went through a bunch of these, and I'll try and give a somewhat speedy version of that. So the first one we have is cookie-based authentication, and this is really when you're wanting to build something with the REST API that is part of the WordPress site already. So that could be something like an admin tool that you build in the WordPress admin that uses the REST API. For that, you're probably going to want authentication if you're going to maybe provide a custom experience that allows people to create users in a different way, or maybe you have MetaBox, which allows you to search for private posts or something. So for that, you're going to want to use the cookie-based authentication. The easiest way to use that is via WP.API, which is automatically loaded in WordPress. So this is kind of WordPress's core library for using the REST API. Which is a backbone library, which Adam is going to talk about a lot more later. I'm sure it'll make a lot more sense exactly how to use that. But the important thing to know here is if you use the core WP API client, you're just using cookie authentication out of the box. So if the user is logged in to your site, either on the front end or the WordPress admin, then your requests are automatically going to be authenticated as that user. So you don't really need to worry about anything. If you try and use cookie authentication for something that isn't part of a site, you're going to run into a lot of problems, and it's kind of conceptually doesn't really fit as an external thing so well. Though it is possible, I broadly kind of keep the scope of cookie-based authentication to something running within the same PHP environment as your WordPress site. Basic auth, which is aptly named so because it's very easy. This is the kind of authentication that something like htaccess uses. So when your browser does that automatic kind of pop-up to ask username and password, that is using basic auth. Basic auth is broadly considered to be not secure for users to be entering their username and password, mainly because the data is sent over plain text to the server, and it's also a bit of a authentication anti-pattern to allow users to enter their credentials in anything other than the WordPress login form. That is kind of meant to be a trusted area where the user is educated really to only ever enter their login details in the WordPress login form. Otherwise, I think the idea is if you encourage people to enter their username and password in different areas, it's kind of easier for things like phishing attacks to surface just because people are not used to being a little more skeptical of where they're entering their username and password. So basic auth, as I mentioned, is very easy to do. Here's an example of using curl for that. So in terms of its applicability, I would say, broadly speaking, it is good for testing purposes in local development, and it's also quite a valid use case for server-to-server authentication if you're using HTTPS. Something like an OAuth flow doesn't really fit very well when you don't have an actual user present. So when you have server-to-server communication, basic auth is, I'd say, an acceptable solution to that problem. But again, I would steer away from it for any browser-based stuff, just because the security implications are really not worth kind of trying to solve that way. Something like an OAuth flow would be much better for that. So for doing the kind of applications where maybe you're building a native app, or maybe you have a completely decoupled web app, or maybe you have an app that allows people to connect to different WordPress sites, for all those kind of flows, then OAuth is really the recommended approach, I would say, or something quite similar to it. And the basic idea of OAuth is to have a system of delegated authentication where you're really giving permission as a user to the application to do stuff on your behalf. So this is kind of what logging with Facebook is, or something like that, again, allowing your GitHub account accessed by another service. Those are all using an OAuth flow, and users are pretty used to this, I think. Facebook has probably helped a lot there in just kind of making people not super confused. If they go to use your app that you've built and they, click, I want to post this to my WordPress site, they're not really surprised by the fact that they're redirected to their WordPress site to say, do you want to allow this app to have access to all of your stuff? So as I'm sure many of you know, there is a new thing called, well, it's not really new, but it's compared to OAuth 1, called OAuth 2, which has a strike through here because, broadly speaking, and again, depending on the class of application that you're building, OAuth 2 is a little more limited in its scope because it requires the use of HTTPS. And though I would recommend everybody use HTTPS in the whole world, and everybody should certainly be upgrading, the truth is right now that is not the case. I believe it's a very optimistic estimate of the amount of sites, WordPress sites on HTTPS is somewhere around 20%. So if you're building an application that you want people to be able to connect to their own WordPress site where you don't have any control over whether it's using HTTPS or not, then you're going to struggle with something like OAuth 2, naturally. I think it's going to be quite a long time before we're at a appropriate amount of HTTPS adoption really to use OAuth 2 widespread. I'm a little more skeptical even with things like Let's Encrypt and many other services giving away free SSL certificates. I would not say we're likely in the next 5 years to get a vast majority of HTTPS sites where we can kind of something as fundamental as allowing you to authenticate with your WordPress site. I'm of the opinion, anyway, that it's definitely very early to be kind of thinking in that way. I think if we look at how long we've supported users through insecure versions of PHP, I think it's difficult to make the case that we should adopt OAuth 2 so early on, even now at potentially 20%, though I think it's a little lower than that. We've got a long way to go. So for now, I say OAuth 1 is the way to go. That's kind of where I put most of my time supporting and developing the OAuth 1 plugin. But if you are able to control your own site and that is what you're doing communication with, obviously OAuth 2 is just as valid in that use case because you can use HTTPS. So how do we do OAuth 1? Step 1, install the OAuth 1 plugin. Step 2, you have to create an app in your WordPress dashboard. So this is very similar to, as an app developer, you would register an account with Twitter or Facebook, and you would go to developer.facebook.com and you create an application. It would give you a key and secret, which you then use in your app to do the OAuth flow. You have to do the same thing with WordPress. And because WordPress is not one system, as in all WordPresses are completely separated from each other, you have to do this on every single WordPress site that you want to communicate with. So more on that later and how kind of making that can be a little simpler. So step 3 is we can just continue as usual with the OAuth 1 protocol using the app keys that we get from WordPress. You kind of don't want to hear me just talk about OAuth 1 for ages because it will probably make your headache a little bit. But there's great documentation, I think that was primarily written by Ryan McHugh at oauth1.wpapi.org, which I think is actually some of the best OAuth 1 generic documentation that is out there. But this is also WordPress specific, and we'll give you the perspective from there as well. Again, I would kind of, if you're thinking of building things like mobile apps or integrations that allow people to communicate with their own WordPress website, OAuth, again, is really the best solution out there. It is not super simple, but with libraries, it doesn't have to be super difficult. I think the fact of the matter is that authentication is a difficult problem. Security is difficult also. And therefore, you're probably just going to have to get your hands a little dirty with kind of wading through, understanding how it all works if you don't have that background already. So as I was saying before, the steps to use OAuth for a user are quite arduous. They have to install the plugin on their site. Not only do they have to do that, they have to go and create an app in the WordPress admin, and then they have to provide the app developer with those keys. So if you're building an application where you want it to be a super smooth experience for a user just to be able to use their WordPress site, that's probably not really going to cut it in terms of ergonomics for the user. And this is a difficult problem that is broadly unsolved in authentication mechanisms. The idea that WordPress is completely decentralized, but we have a REST API that allows you to talk to all WordPress sites in the same way is a little bit at odds with each other, because though you can use the same code to speak to all WordPress sites, you can't use the same authentication keys and everything because they're not linked together in any way. So the way that we've kind of tried to solve this is a system which has been dubbed brokered authentication. It's a bad branding name. I think we need something a bit more zingy, but this is kind of a technical take on it. So I think last year or so, maybe longer, I was in Australia with Ryan, and we were trying to work out this problem of what would be an acceptable solution to be able to communicate with every WordPress site in the world, but not necessarily have all of the downsides that come with that. A lot of WordPress owners do not want to buy into some centralized authentication system. They don't want to open up their site to access to anything that this centralized system decides to give access to their site. But we also want it to be easy for users and people that do have sites that want to do that. So again, this is fairly kind of unsolved problems and uncharted territory, I think. There's also the problem of compromised apps for this kind of thing. When you're doing app authentication, if you have some super popular app that is then hacked, you don't really want the 100,000 people that have allowed access for that app to their sites to now be vulnerable to that application. So again, if you had just people individually creating OAuth apps on all of their sites by the 100,000s and providing those keys, it'd be very difficult to then contact that 100,000 people and say, oh, by the way, you should probably delete this app that just got hacked. So there needs to be some kind of revocation process. So the kind of solution we came up with is living at apps.wpapi.org, which is kind of a currently early stage experiment, I suppose, for how to solve this problem. So the idea here is to provide some level of trusted or centralized repository of registered apps. So as a developer, you can go to apps.wpapi.org and you can create a new application for maybe your mobile app or something like that. You plug in your kind of usual stuff that you would when creating an OAuth app, the callback URL, which is where the user is sent after they click allow in their WordPress site. And once you have done that, as a developer, you essentially have some keys that then, by some magic in the background, you're going to be able to use to communicate with any website. That doesn't mean being authenticated with any website. You still have to get the user's permission and everything. But this solves the first step of OAuth, which is to have an application sitting on everybody's site. So that flow looks a little bit like this. There's really three parties involved here. There is the app that you're building, which could be a client that is sitting on your phone. There's the WordPress site you want to talk to, which could be your own site, or the user that is using your app. It could be their WordPress site that they want to share something to from your app. And then there is the app broker, which is at apps.wpapi.org. So step one is when the app wants to communicate with your site, it actually contacts the broker and asks the broker to be able to communicate with the site. The next thing is the broker needs to contact the site and say, please create me an app in an OAuth sense so I can connect this client to you. So the WordPress site creates that and passes some keys back to the broker, and then the broker forwards those keys onto the app. So all we've done here is the initial bootstrap of having some key and secret to be able to communicate with a WordPress site directly. After that, then the app can just do the normal WordPress OAuth 1 flow and get the user's permission by redirecting them there, generate a token, get the access token, all of that type of stuff. So to kind of read more about this, you can go to apps.wpapi.org/spec, where there's a rather, I'd say, difficult to read spec. If you've ever read specs before, this is that kind of language. You can also go to /app developers to get some more friendly documentation and description of how things work. So client libraries are a big part of consuming an API. The usual first thing that I do when I want to integrate with a system using their API is look for what client libraries are available. If I'm using WordPress, then I want to probably find a PHP library. If I'm building a JavaScript app, I want to find a JavaScript library. Some APIs are simple enough not to require that. And you can certainly use the WordPress REST API just using direct HTTP calls, but I'd probably recommend you at least look to see what clients are available. So the kind of first and foremost, which is bundled in WordPress Core itself, is the backbone client. This is kind of very solid backbone bindings for all of the data in the WordPress REST API. So it allows you to do things like fetch pages. You can just update a value and you can sync it to the backend just using Backbone as you normally would. And the only thing that you need to do to use that is just call WP script WP-API, and now you have access in JavaScript to the WP.API object, if you like, to be able to use that. So that's a super easy way if you're building plugins or themes plugins that are in the admin or the front end as well can use this mechanism. And like I said, this will be authenticated for you. It will do auto discovery of all of your endpoints, including custom routes and things like that. So it's really quite powerful. The second one is one that I wrote really just because I wanted to be able to use OAuth 1 from JavaScript. So you can just install that with npm install. This is kind of a very, I'd say, basic client that just allows you to do the OAuth flow and then send requests to endpoints and with get, post, or delete. So that's kind of one required if you want to use OAuth 1. At the moment, it is the only library to support OAuth 1 that I'm aware of for the REST API. I think the next one I'm going to talk about is going to be adding support to the Backbone client. Again, has a branch, I believe, where it's kind of getting merged in at some point, hopefully. So going on to the third one is called WP API. These are all quite similarly named. Apologies for that. And this is a isomorphic client that can be used in Node or in the browser. And you can install that with npm install WP API. And this is really a kind of query builder on steroids, I'd say. Like, it will connect to the WordPress REST API. It will interpret all of the routes and the schema, a little bit like the Backbone client, and provide you very nice names to be able to do, API.getPages or whatever. It automatically builds all of this stuff for you. So all of these are JavaScript. There are people developing other language ones as well, I'd say. There's a lot of contribution to be done in this area still if you feel so inclined. It would be great to kind of get these documented and onto the WPAPI.org website. So that's kind of all consuming the REST API. However, we're, probably a good amount of us are WordPress developers. We write PHP, things like that. We may be on the side of a REST API project where we're expected to change the REST API, to add new data to it, to add new routes to it, to add new custom post types, things like that. So I'm going to quickly kind of skate through here all of the kind of backend section of the REST API. And an important part of that is how an example request works in the REST API. So in the REST API, you need a route. So you can do that with register REST route. You pass it a namespace and the route itself, a request callback, and also the method that it's going to be used for. So once WordPress knows this about your route, when a request comes in from the browser, it hits a WP JSON rewrite rule. That is passed to the REST server. The REST server then works out what endpoint needs to be matched for that, in this case, WP v2 posts. It then calls the callback for that. The callback will generate some data, like the list of posts. So it passes an array of posts. The server takes that array of posts, it will JSON encode it for the client, and then send it back to the browser. So that's really the flow of everything that is coming into WordPress at the WordPress level. When you have to tweak things, you should be able to conceptually see where should I change things to add new things, things like that. So a lot of just modifying the REST API is going to be including custom data that you have. WordPress has quite good primitives now for making different post types and things like that. So you can specify show in REST when you're making custom taxonomies and post types. So that is just an extra flag that you pass when you're registering a post type. You can do the same thing with taxonomies, just to do show in REST. This is just going to mean the REST API is going to include those things in your data now. You can also use register meta to include post meta in the REST API. You can use register settings to include settings in the REST API. You use register REST field, again, to add on completely custom items that you want, maybe that aren't backed by post meta in the REST API. You can use WP REST controller to implement completely custom routes that don't follow the usual REST API endpoints that we have. And that works something by creating a custom class which extends WP REST controller. Then you have kind of get item, update item, delete item, things like that. That's all I've got. Thank you very much. And I think I've run a little over, but if you have any questions, we may have a minute for those. Okay, thank you.
Does anyone have a question for Jay? We have people with mics that I can bring them to you.
Hey, so if you are doing like server-to-server communication, but not over HTTPS, like over HTTP, do you have like a preferred authentication method for that?
Good question. My preferred approach would be to somehow get HTTPS, but that's not always possible. What I would probably do in that situation is use OAuth 1, but you would just have to manually generate the access token and go through the flow yourself. Okay. So there are some tools that do this. Say like command line tools don't work with the OAuth flow, so sometimes they would like give you a URL that you need to visit, and then it would say, okay, paste the response of what you get at this URL back into the command line. You're going to need to do some kind of flow like that to actually allow generating the token. Once you've done that, then you can just use OAuth 1 with the token, and you're going to be able to do it. It's going to, you're probably going to want to just say to yourself how important is security at this point, and either if you're just, I don't know, doing something fairly trivial and something you're not worried about, sure, use basic auth over HTTP, accept that there is insecurity there, but it's not still as bad as HTTP with basic auth on the client side, where something like a coffee shop is just going to blow about your whole security model. Yeah, but there's no other great alternative that I'm aware of, really. HTTP is unfortunately just everything is out in the open, so it's complicated to then do handshakes in that scenario.
Thanks.
Thank you. Are there any other questions?
I can be loud.
Sure.
Is there a preferred method for extending the REST controller class when you're unclear if the site has the REST API via plugin, via core, or not at all?
Right. So because the WordPress REST API was only introduced in, for the infrastructure, so doing custom endpoints 4.5. If you want to support less than 4.5, I would say you're basically out of luck, because the plugin is also, at this point, the compatibility just kind of isn't there for something that old. I mean, it will probably work. I'm probably speaking a little bit incorrectly there, but it's just like, I would focus my effort on trying to get people to upgrade, probably. But in terms of people using the plugin, like the direct answer is people using the plugin and using Core, the interfaces are the same for both of those. There's some like very minor tweaks that you're probably not going to need to worry about. In terms of supporting people that don't even have the REST API plugin, you're just going to need to like detect if they've got the plugin installed. But I think if you look at the stats, the percentage is quite small on that end of pre 4.5. All right.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you very much.